Ready to work? All right, go ahead. How's it going, everybody? We're going to have some fun here and look at some PowerShell enabled malware. Is that a problem? So see a few friendly faces here, so thanks for coming, guys. Appreciate it. Just start off, big thank you to DerbyCon. I love being here, seeing so many nice people. This is one of my favorite cons to come to for sure, so definitely excited and happy to be here. A little bit about me. This is it the I didn't realize I was cutting the top there. 1 second. Displays are hard, so. In the. Oh, okay, I'll do that. Well, can I just arrow key? Yep, that'll work. Okay, sorry about that. So a little bit about who I am. Threat researcher for Fidelis Cybersecurity. Teach some classes, few certifications and things. So just a little bit about the agenda we're going to cover. So why PowerShell as an attack platform? Why do malware authors like it in some ways? We'll look at some different cases and then maybe look at some ideas of some future and what malware authors could do with PowerShell. And then just a few ideas on some prevention. So, oh, but then my GIFs don't play. That's a bummer. So PowerShell, why it's so attractive, built into modern versions of Windows. It's very powerful. So, I mean, system admins are getting a lot of good use out of it, but then also red teams have been using it for all kinds of different things. So it's good for both good and evil. So what all do you have? You have access to the Windows API, the .NET framework. You can run commands. You can perform injections, mess with the registry, WMI, services. Pretty much anything is fair game with PowerShell. I might go back to the top's cut. That's all right. We look at malware. What all do you want to do with malware usually? So they want to be able to download and execute code, plugins. We want to be able to interact with the C2. We want to persist, hide things, steal things. Those are kind of all different common things that malware wants to do. All of that we can do with PowerShell. So, and that's like my favorite image in the world of a T-Rex riding a shark with dynamite and a gun. So, first case looking at here is Prescient. Trend Michael came out with a write-up on it a while back. It comes in as an email with a zip file and then a shortcut. And then from there, it's going to download a PowerShell script, execute the PowerShell script, which then downloads the final binary that's capable of stealing information, basically. So there we have kind of the first stage of using a link file and then downloading PowerShell, which is the downloader, and goes further on. Another case, VawTrack is pretty popular out there. It's really cutting off the top. So it comes in as a fish with an Office macro. And as a guy from Virus Bulletin, Grutin, pointed out, this year we've seen a big resurgence of a lot of macro-based malware, just because a lot of organizations are filtering out executables. They're not allowing jar files and things to come in by emails. So macro makes a great attack platform. A lot of pen testers are using that as well. So it's easy to phish a user to open and run a macro. Here's an example. Just tells them, hey, you need to enable macros and be able to see this. Or you tell somebody that this is salary information, and it's all blank, and you have to enable the macros to see what's going on. So they will social engineer the user into enabling macros. And then as an analyst, you get this sample, and maybe you want to look at it and analyze it. A lot of them are password protected. I've seen some people try to brute force those passwords and things, but there's kind of a simple trick to get around that. If you start off with one of the older OLE formats, doc or XLS, you can just go from there. But if you get one of the XML formats, resave it back as the OLE. And then from there, just open it in a hex editor and look for this DPB string. And then actually just replace it with these bytes here. And that's changing the password to password. This is just an example of doing that. And then right from within Office, you can open up the macro in the Visual Basic Editor, look at it right from there, go to Edit, type in your password, and then you can run it through the debugger and let the code. A lot of times it's really obfuscated, so you can let it run through the debugger and figure out what it's doing. In this example, you can see a few of the variables that were stored. They're downloading a text file from a C2 to execute more code. So with VAWTrack, it's actually kind of doing like these multiple different stages of things. So it's downloading a batch file, a Visual Basic file, PowerShell, and a binary. So kind of the flow of that is user runs the macro, he runs the batch file, the Visual Basic script runs the PowerShell with the DAS execution policy, or bypass execution policy, so that helps to bypass any execution policies, hides warnings and errors. PowerShell then downloads the binary, and then which can then steal information and do all its badness. So it's kind of just like multiple stages to help obfuscate what they're doing. So moving on to our next case here is Powlix. And Powlix is kind of interesting that it uses PowerShell to inject do memory injection, and then it also uses the registry to do like a fileless infection, which is kind of a really interesting thing to not have a file actually on the hard drive for antivirus to scan. So Kofter, another malware family out there, actually just this week, kind of a benefit of procrastinating on your slides is you can get like really current stuff. So this was just this week, Symantec released a report about Kofter, and they're kind of emulating the techniques of Powlix. So I grabbed a sample of Kofter to look at here. And Kofter is a really friendly and nice malware, and it'll actually install PowerShell for you if you don't have it. So whether you want it or not, you're going to get it to help them along in their process. So it's actually reaching out to that KB if you're on XP, and it'll install it for you. And another thing that it does really interesting that kind of tricks up some analysts is that the registry entry will start with a null byte entry. So if you try to look at it in regedit, it'll give you this error here, and you can't see what it's doing. But there's another tool, Jameer, will let you see that actually here, and you can see starting with the null byte. And the top of it, you can see what's in the registry entry, W script, and it's kind of obfuscated a little bit. And below, I just deobfuscated kind of the main command where it's looking at another place in registry to run some more. So we have more JavaScript, which then decodes and executes PowerShell, which then injects Kofter into memory. So we got moving on to our next case here. We're looking at Poshcoder, and you can see at the top I had like a cool PowerShell command, but we can't see that. But so it's a ransomware that's going to encrypt files with AES, and then it sends that key over RSA, or using RSA, asymmetric encryption. It starts out as a .NET executable, we can see here. It looks like a text file icon, so of course that's safe to click for a user. They know those are safe, right? Double click it, and within that there's a PowerShell script embedded. So starting off looking at a .NET executable, DNSpy is my favorite tool for looking at .NET. It's kind of was built on ILSpy. It's a newer tool, it just came out this year that I really like. And plus it's like got this nice cool black hacker background, so that makes it better. when you look at Poshcoder, there's some resources here, and you can see some of the PowerShell settings with the execution policy bypass. The window style is hidden, and then also on the left, the scripts.zip, there's like an embedded scripts file that is actually going to unzip. And when we unzip that, we actually get this cryptor.ps1. It's a super nicely commented PowerShell script. So it's really easy to see what it's doing, which is really helpful as an analyst so that you know what it's doing. So here we can see it tells you, getting the computer GUID that it's going to use. And then the run key that we've seen over and over again for persistence installing itself there. So looking at a little bit more at the code, we can see some of the RSA stuff that it's doing. With the key, it's encrypting the symmetric key for AES. And then we can see it's placing the script into registry. Some salt. These are all the files that we're actually looking for and that it's going to encrypt, so you can see what all it would be messing with. That's going to cut off on the side too. So here's the actually encrypting the file going through with AES, and then down at the bottom we can see it renames the files Poshcoder at the end. A lot of the different malware has its own, or ransomware has its own kind of extension that it's renaming stuff. So this one renames it .poshcoder and drops a HTML file with that nice message about unlocking your files. So just as an example, we have our precious family happy cat, and we get this text file that we open up. And then we get this HTML document and our cat goes away. One thing that's interesting with Poshcoder, it's not actually messing with the shadow files. So you can use Shadow Explorer and restore our happy cat just by exporting it here. So we got him back. He was priceless. I was happy too. So here we have another one. This was PowerWorm. This is kind of doing more of a worm. Crygent is another name for it. It used Office macros and PowerShell. So here's an actual macro of a sample I found on VirusTotal, and they actually redacted a lot of the encoded base64 stuff in the macro on the sample on VirusTotal. But you can see how it's launching PowerShell and doing an encoded command. And when it does encoded command, it's bypassing a lot of the built-in security with execution policies. So that was the MD5 of the sample. It's kind of hard to come across samples of PowerWorm, but Matt Graber was nice enough to create a GitHub repo of it. He basically rewrote it, deobfuscated it, and kind of redacted some of the more dangerous parts. So just kind of looking through what he redid with that. We can see the GUID again. A lot of malware uses the GUID as kind of a unique value. The run key again, over and over again for persistence. And then there's also a function here to do a DNS lookup. Go through further. PowerWorm actually uses Tor and Polypo for its C2 communications. So that in one way it kind of helps to hide its traffic, but then in another way, if you're watching, your network, any Tor traffic should really stick out to you. So, that's kind of one thing. It's good and bad, I guess, for both sides. And we can see it's installing that and using it for a URL there. And it'll grab other payloads and run those. These are some of the other payloads, like a base64 encrypted. And then it's using a VB script to run those. We can see the same thing doing that encoded command. And then it also, similarly, like we were looking at with Covter and Powlix, it's actually going to store those encoded payloads in the registry. So there isn't a file, it's just encoded in a registry, which is kind of a neat technique. So kind of continuing on with that, you can see the post parameters. A lot of malware tries to spoof over HTTP. HTTPS. So it's grabbing all the system information and embedding it into a post request there. And then here, it's kind of a scary part with PowerShell, right? We talked about how one of the things malware wants to do is be able to download and run other code. This is really easy for it. It's like almost built in just to be able to download a stream and then just invoke expression and run that. So that's kind of scary. It can do whatever you want. And during his testing, he wasn't able to get the second payload, so I'm not really sure what that does. But and this is kind of another little interesting thing that this worm does is it'll go through and infect other Office files with this malicious macro, and it'll register a WMI event when there's a new drive. So if there's a drive that has an Office file, it'll actually try to infect those, and so it's spreading. And then in order to add that malicious macro, it needs to change some security settings. It's also doing that there at the bottom. Kind of a similar tactic we saw with an APT actor called Deep Panda. So we have the awesome Panda here. They like to be kind of more stealthy, so avoiding AV, not dropping a file, kind of similar. We're kind of continuing along that line. Running this PowerShell hidden style and encoded. And what they did, you can see what they were doing, setting up their downloading the data, moving forward, and they're actually using PowerShell to then download a wafer .NET executable, injecting it into memory, and then that is actually downloading a rat that they like, Mad Hatter, as the final step to have that full kind of remote access. So that's an example of the PowerShell that they're doing to do that. And so those are a few kind of cases of some malware examples. And then a lot of pen testers have actually kind of developed some tools to show some of the capabilities that PowerShell has, and this is one of them just recently. Kind of like a point of sale one-liner. You put it out on GitHub. So with this PowerShell command, you're going to download and inject this memscraper point of sale malware, or kind of a proof of concept kind of thing. It's not really malware per se, but it's just checking to see if the browser's running, and if it is, it's going to dump the process for that, and then it's going to check to see if it's a credit card and post that up if it is. This is Camilleri. Just recently this write-up came up. It's kind of interesting. So here's just kind of a screenshot showing the track data, and it's posting up. And of course, talking about PowerShell, we can't not talk about kind of the PowerSploit framework and Matt Graber's work with that. So, just with this one command, you can inject an interpreter payload into another remote machine and get super excited, right? Like this guy. So you're not touching disk, you're injecting an interpreter, all the functions of Metasploit and interpreter, right there at your hands, just with PowerShell. So then, if that's not bad, Mimikatz is used by a lot of attackers to dump credentials. So a similar command using the PowerSploit framework, dump on a remote machine, injecting Mimikatz into memory, dumping all the credentials, and this gorilla just kind of has had enough at that point. He gives up. It's kind of an example of just kind of what the output. You're running that command on the previous machine and running it against a remote machine and just dumping the credentials. Grumpy Cat's excited about it. And then FuzzyNop did some stuff with a OSA script. Another person did the same thing kind of with a PowerShell script after seeing that. So, if you don't have the credentials, another thing that malware could do is just, especially if malware is targeting an enterprise, is just ask. Like most users would enter in their credentials, probably not even think twice. So that's just like a system. It looks like a system pop-up that pops up. So just type it in and post it out to the bad guys there. And then another interesting example of another technique that we're kind of building on with all these different techniques and cases is Dave Kennedy's Unicorn. So what's really interesting about that is you can use it in a macro, and you just run it, and it generates a Metasploit resource file, and then this PowerShell attack.txt. We can see it's doing the same thing with the hidden window and the encoded command. Just there's a bunch of junk after the JAAX. But what's really cool about that is you can put that into a macro, and then it's actually doing a, if it can run on a 32-bit or 64-bit, it'll downgrade if it's on 64-bit. So that kind of gives a lot more different attack surface for a bad guy. You can go over either 32 or 64-bit. And here I just kind of decoded, base64 decoded what gets dumped out into that PowerShell.txt. I picture that's like Dave Kennedy. But not too much there. Yes. Yes, just everything. Yeah. So kind of as the reason we're kind of looking at all these cases is one, they're kind of fun. I love looking at different malware, but also kind of looking at, what techniques. There's a lot of common techniques, as you saw, and then there's also some kind of unique ones to each example. So if we looked at kind of the evolution, what would be possible if a malware author just really wanted to use PowerShell and like combine a lot of these techniques. Maybe they could do some stuff with that x86, x64 downgrade that we saw in Unicorn. Always do that encoded base64 bypass, and then persisting in the registry, and then using that null byte that kind of messes with regedit. Somebody's doing incident response that might not have seen that technique before. They open up regedit, and it just crashes. Might figure it out, they might not. And then also kind of another technique, we saw that, one example was using Tor and Polippo. We've seen some other malware kind of recently be using common services that everybody's going to allow in their network, and like Twitter or GitHub, and do that over HTTPS, and then you go out to that. It really is hard to kind of stand out on your network traffic. So they're blending it over HTTPS, that could be bad. And then another thing, getting credentials either with like a pop-up like this or using Mimikatz, and then dumping that out, and then kind of doing some of the, and then pivoting from there to other machines, spreading kind of like a worm, or infecting other Office macro files. In an Office environment, everybody's passing Office documents back and forth between each other. They're doing edits and sending things back and forth to each other. So, that could be especially bad. So what are we talking about for defense? As always, disable macros. They're pretty dangerous. Some people say that they need them kind of in those unique cases. Maybe they need like a segmented VM to do some of that stuff, or like on another machine. It's just pretty dangerous to be running, arbitrary code. App locker is another thing for PowerShell, stopping app locker. And then kind of as another step, monitoring network traffic, that's definitely important. And then enabling module logging, that'll give you a lot more details on what is actually doing with PowerShell. So it's important to have that turned on, and this is kind of an example. So we kind of talked about why PowerShell, why it's so powerful, why malware authors might like it, some of the techniques they're doing, and then kind of some future cases. We see like Kofter was taking techniques from Powlix. What if they start, combining some of these techniques to show, how dangerous it could be. And, PowerShell is definitely something that we have to kind of worry about and take care of. So a few resources. These guys are pretty prolific about PowerShell, and they've been talking about it for quite a while. So that's all. I'll make these slides available. Some of these are kind of cut off, kind of hard to read. I try to jam pack it with a lot of information. So that'll be available for you guys. So I think I'm getting told to cut out. So that's it. No worries.